Hello, everyone. This is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and I want to say welcome to you. Welcome to this snarky and modern stitch along. I am really very excited and so happy that I get this opportunity to share embroidery with you. I know that many of you, most of you, are maybe primarily cross stitchers. I know some of you have done some embroidery before, or this might be your first project, but regardless, I just want to say I'm so glad you're here and I'm really excited to dive into this really fun embroidery design and share with you my love of hand embroidery. All right, so before we get to the technical how to do this specific design we're going to work on, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of sort of cross stitch versus embroidery and some of the supplies that you can use and some of the things you do with embroidery and how it compares to cross stitch a little bit. So first of all, let's talk about fabric because that's probably one of the biggest differences. And with cross stitch, you use an even weave, a grid, a gridded Aida that has holes in it. Embroidery, you can do embroidery on Aida. You really can, and I've seen it done. But it's a little bit limiting because there's only very specific places that your needle can come up or go down. So generally for embroidery, we use a tighter weave of fabric. Now, before I go on, stitch. Let me just say stitch. You can stitch on many kinds of fabrics: linen, denim, canvas, knit T-shirts, knit fabric, pillowcases, all kinds of fabric. Um, it's limitless almost. But one of my favorite fabrics to stitch on, and one of the most common for, especially for the kind of stitching that I tend to do the most, is 100% cotton. And it's not just cotton. I like to use a nice quality, I call it 100% cotton, quilting cotton. And I just say that because generally quilting fabrics in general tend to be a little bit nicer quality. You can buy super, super cheap cotton fabrics that will work, but they are pretty thin. Um, Usually the quilting fabrics tend to be a little, they cost a little bit more, that's true, but you don't tend to use, yards and yards of it for this. It's generally pretty small pieces. Sort of small pieces. So that's what I generally recommend. That's what I sell in my shop is this really nice quilting cotton, 100% cotton. You can stitch on like a synthetic fabric like polyester or rayon. I like the feel of the needle and thread going through the cotton, and sometimes like if it has a polyester cotton in it, that works fine. Don't get me wrong, it works just fine. But sometimes the repeated pulling that thread through the polyester will sort of fray your thread a little bit faster, but that's not always that big of a deal. Okay, so that's my favorite kind of fabric to use for embroidery. Next up, let's talk about thread. And one of the most common things, just like in cross stitch, is your classic DMC 6-stranded cotton embroidery thread. Love it. And there's other brands too. DMC is probably the most common. But you can use other threads at cross stitch too, but I think generally it's the 6-stranded. So with embroidery, there are a wide range of things you can use. So there is silk thread. Silk thread is a dream to stitch with. It is more expensive, it's true, but often, not always, but sometimes it comes like a 12 strand as opposed to a 6 strand. So you'll get more out of it, a yard of a silk thread, than you will get out of a yard of the 6-stranded. But anyway, silk thread is just luscious to work with. There's also thread called pearl thread, pearl cotton. Sometimes in DMC it's spelled P-E-R-L-E. That's the French version, but it's also pearl, like P-E-A-R-L. But it comes in different sizes. This is a number 5. This is the DMC version of a number 5 pearl cotton thread, and it has a much it has a shine, much more. Let me see how to describe it. A much more obvious twist to it, and it has kind of a sheen, and it is not meant to be separated, but it is really beautiful on when you use it. For instance, let me show you. Can you see this right here? Make sure you can see this. See these little stitches up here? That is pearl thread with bullion stitches. I don't have anything. Oh, also right here, these leaves, the veins on these leaves are with pearl thread. So maybe you can see how the shiny twist of it shows up a little bit more. So that's really fun. So pearl thread, a lot of fun. Don't have to separate it. You can also use yarn. I love using yarn on embroidery designs. This one is done with yarn, and you see it's very textural. If I hold it to the side, can you see how it's all this raised texture? That's a lot of fun. Has some considerations when you're stitching with yarn, but anyway, that's a lot of fun too. And let me see. That's it for thread. Generally, I mean, there's probably something else you can use, but you can embroider with ribbon too. I don't do a lot of that, or haven't for a while, but that's another kind of thread that you can use. So those are the basic threads. Next up, let's talk about needles. So needles are a big difference between cross stitch and embroidery, because the needles that you use for cross stitch have a blunt tip, because the hole is already there in the fabric in which you're stitching, the grid with the hole, all right? And you put the needle right down in the hole. For embroidery, you can put the needle down anywhere, and you need a sharp point to pierce, to separate those fibers as it goes through. So with embroidery, we use needles with a sharp point, okay? And yes, I poke my finger at least once every time I sit down to stitch, but and there are many. I'll admit, embroidery needles can be confusing, because you go to the store and you look at the packages, and there's one that's just labeled embroidery needles, and it's got a bunch of numbers at the bottom, and they're all different sizes. I decided early on I was going to find a size and style of needle that I like and just stick with it, and that's what I have done. Now, just like a cross stitch needle, embroidery needles have a larger eye, because we're putting like multiple strands through, so that's the same thing as a cross stitch needle. But the needles that I have found that I like the best are called chenille needles. And I don't know really why they're chenille needles as opposed to something else, but it was just an easy way to identify that that is the needle I am using. It's called a chenille needle, and I use generally 3 sizes, usually, unless I'm doing something special. My most common size is called a number 24 chenille needle. Now let me see if I can get that up here so you can see it. Okay, so there is the number 24. All right, and it has a little bit of weight to it, and I can fit anywhere between 1 to 5 or 6 strands through this. All right, but generally, if you stitch with 2 or 3 or 4 strands, this is the perfect just sort of mid-range needle that I like to use. If I am stitching with 1 or 2 strands, I go down to the number 26 chenille needle. It's a little bit smaller, and so therefore the eye is smaller, so that's why I don't try to cram 5 or 6 strands through here, but it has a little bit, just a little bit smaller. And then the other one is a number 20 chenille needle, so a much larger eye, still a sharp point, and a much larger shaft. Now the shaft also makes a difference. How big the shaft is will create a different size hole. So that's why when I'm doing a little bit more delicate work, like this right here, see this viola right here? That's called needle painting. So it's, you're using 1 strand of thread generally. You can use more, but generally it's 1 strand. And you're coming up in the stitching you've already done. So this nice small needle is perfect for that. Okay, 1 strand, kind of a more delicate stitching. But then, for instance, like with this yarn that I have used, first of all, I needed, I mean, this is the same, this is the yarn I used on that one. I mean, obviously you can see it is it's very thick, so I needed a much larger eye there. So that was the first thing, that's the first reason I used the number 20 on that one. But also the larger shaft, as it goes through the fabric, it makes a larger hole. And I needed the hole to be larger for this really thick yarn to be able to pull it through the fabric. All right, and any thick yarn or thread, like even the pearl, needs a slightly larger. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can use the smaller needle and you can get it through the fabric, but a larger shaft will help make that a little bit easier. So that is kind of the rundown on needles. I do sometimes use some specialty needles. For instance, this one's called a milliner's needle. So it's long, but the main thing about this one is that the shaft is the same. I'm sorry, the eye is it's the same width up here by the eye as it is on the shaft, and there's reasons to do that. Like for instance, these bullion stitches are you wrapping the thread a lot and then you're pulling the needle through all those wraps, so that makes that easier. So that's just one example. And then the other one that I tend to use pretty frequently is this little tiny baby one. It's called a number 10 short beading needle, and that is because it has a really tiny eye in it. I've got one strand of thread in it here, but it has a really tiny eye for when you need to get through beads that have a small, once again, I'll show you this one. See those beads? They have a little tiny eye, a little tiny hole in them, sorry, or like bugle beads. And sometimes these needles that have a larger eye for more strands, you just can't get them through there. So that's why I use the short beading needle. But generally, the 24 or the 26 is the most commonly used needle that I use. I am going to jump back and talk about thread just a little bit, but not what type of thread, but more about preparing your thread for stitching. And what I'm talking about here is called stripping, and that is a method for separating your strands of thread. I know that using different numbers of strands of thread for cross stitch is the same. Sometimes you don't always use 6 strands, you use different numbers of strands, but and so you have probably already have experience or had experience with stripping threads or separating strands of thread. But it is not an overstatement to say that when I learned to strip thread versus, this is not a full 6 strand, but if you'd like need to, and you just take them and you just pull them apart. I did that for many years, and honestly, it drove me nuts because it as you're trying to pull it apart, it wants to twist back together, and you get a big knot, and you got to go super slow, and you're holding one end in your mouth, and if that works for you, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong. I will just say that stripping threads makes a huge difference, and separating, like if you need 3 strands, you pull one strand, separate it, pull a second strand, separate it, pull a third strand, and then recombine them, makes all the difference in the world for how your stitching looks. At least it does for me. So I have a whole video on my YouTube channel about how to do this. This is the super quick version. It's super simple. So I mean, it's not rocket science. So, but all you do, again, like I said, this is not a 6 strand piece of thread, but it's 3 anyway. So what you're going to do is you're going to hold the end between your fingers. You're going to separate out one strand like that. Hold it gently with these fingers and then pull. And as you pull, see what's happening there? All that other thread is pulling up. And I still have the ends right here. And you're thinking, what a tangled nightmare. But that's not really the case. Really, you just pull it back, and and you just run your fingers down it, and it all straightens back out. And now you have, in this hand, you've got your single strand. So what I do is I pull a strand and I lay it on my table. All right? I know you can't see that because it's really tiny. And then you take the ones that you haven't separated yet, and you pull another. Now I pulled that first one really slowly so you could see it, but honestly, you can pull it out really fast and it stays just fine. So this goes really fast. So then you put that one down, and now you say you've got your last one. It's a single, sorry. And then you line up the ends like that. All right, hold those ends, and then I run my fingers down them, pull it through my fingers so they all get lined up. And now I have my 3 strands of thread ready to stitch. And doing this changed the way I stitch, changed the way my stitches look. So that's why I'm spending all this time on it, telling you about it, because now you have kind of more like a satiny ribbon as opposed to a twisted rope. Occasionally there are some stitches where I don't separate the strands, but generally I do this for everything, no matter whether I'm using 2 strands or 4 strands or 6 or 3 or whatever. I strip my threads every time. So that is your quickie version about how to and why to strip your threads to separate them. Now we come to the part where we are going to talk about transferring the design onto your fabric. So with cross stitch, as you know, you have a blank piece of fabric, of Aida fabric, that you might have put a grid on it, but basically it's blank, and you have a separate pattern that tells you where to put each kind of stitch and each color of stitch of thread. With embroidery, what we do is you transfer the design onto the fabric from a pattern like this, and you transfer the pattern lines, the design, onto the fabric, and then you stitch on top of those lines. And I will be honest, transferring the design onto the fabric is a little bit not so fun, right? But it's like any kind, pretty much any kind of craft that you have to do, anything that you make, there's always some preparatory step that you have to do that is just not as fun as the actual doing of the art, the craft of whatever you're doing. And that's this part. But here's the good thing about transferring the design onto the fabric. Once it's done, you don't have to stress about where to put your stitches anymore. The lines will show you where to stitch. Now, of course, there's instructions, and there might be a stitch chart, or a color chart that shows you, tells you which stitch to put where and which color to put where. But as far as where to actually put the needle in, or take it up in the fabric, that's what these lines do. Shows you right where to stitch. Now, some kits and some designers offer kits or just fabric panels that have the design already pre-printed onto it. And that is super great because you just get to skip that whole step. So here are some examples of fabric that has a design printed onto it. So if I can get a little closer, you can see, this is a printed fabric, and then there's the lines. Here's another one on gray fabric. Same thing. All right. So that, if you get a kit that has the lines, the design already printed onto the fabric, you can skip this whole step about transferring the pattern onto the fabric. But I will say that it is a good skill to know because, every single thing you do might not have a kit that has the pattern pre-printed on it, or you want to draw your own design and transfer it onto the fabric. So it's definitely an excellent skill to know. In addition to this method, or having it, just buying the fabric with the design pre-printed on it, you can also use your home printer to print designs onto fabric. And that's what I've done here. Obviously, she is not finished, but I have, again, another separate video tutorial about how to print designs onto fabric with your home printer. And it works great. It's a very easy method and gives you very accurate lines, and you don't have to trace. So anyway, this is an example. Let me show you up close where you can see that you get nice, very clear lines to stitch over. And I will tell you that how to transfer a pattern onto fabric is one of the most common questions about embroidery ever, along with maybe what kind of fabric to use. How to transfer the design on is really a very common question. And I get it because, there are some different methods, and there are some slightly different methods if you're talking about light fabrics versus dark fabrics. Now, what we're going to be talking about here is transferring onto a light colored fabric, white or light pink, or even some medium colored fabrics. This technique will work. But let me tell you, stitching on dark fabrics is so much fun. I love doing it. And so I have a separate video on my YouTube channel that talks all about how to transfer onto dark fabric. So for instance, like I showed you those pre-printed designs a minute ago that were on dark fabric, and here's the stitch design for that one. And then here's that purple mushroom one. Okay, so it is so much fun to stitch onto dark fabric, but I love just stitching on just colors in general. And this fabric, even though it's a green color, it classifies as a light colored fabric. And I will tell you that this is the method that I use for probably 95% of the designs that I do and put on fabric. Because like I said, it works even on fabrics that you might think would be dark. What this is, it's a tracing method, and we're going to use a bright light behind the hoop to to trace the design onto the fabric. So let's get into the nitty-gritty about how to do this. The first thing you want to do with this method is to stretch your fabric in the hoop. And I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to tell you the piece of advice that when people say, what's your best piece of advice for stitchers or new people who are just starting out? This is it. Get your fabric stretched tightly in this hoop. Why? Because you will be more accurate with everything. You'll be more accurate with the tracing that we're about to do. You'll be more accurate with your stitches. And I mean, if you think about it, look how tight this is. This is like, if I press on it, it does not sag. And I was thinking of an analogy, if you're walking across a bridge, do you want to walk across a bridge that is loose and moves every time you step on it, or do you want a bridge that is sturdy under your feet? You want the sturdy one. I know it's a totally different thing, but that's my analogy. And so there are a couple of things you can do to get really tight fabric. You can use a good hoop. I know there's lots of brands of hoops out there. I have used, for many years, for several years, I used just those like cheaper wooden hoops, and I got them to work. Unfortunately, these days, it's really hard to get good quality cheap hoops, those really sort of inexpensive ones like you find at craft stores and things. Those are really hard to find now. So the ones I use I actually have them in my shop because I love them so much. They are made out of beech wood, which is nice. They have nice, smooth edges and everything. But the best part about them is this right here. It's this heavy brass hardware that has a screw in it right there that you can use a screwdriver. Get that, let me show you, to screw that. I've already screwed this one in, so it's really, really tight. Okay, but you can use a screwdriver to get that really, really tight. So no more trying to like kill your fingers trying to get that thing tight. And this heavy brass does not bend, because the other metal on those other ones is real soft and it squeezes. And the other thing I do is to wrap the inner hoop with twill tape. And all of my hoops, let me grab them here, all of my, what I call my working hoops, I have wrapped hoops. And so like here's one of those from a while back. That's the cheaper hoop. You see that? It has that hardware that is, hopefully that's in focus. That does not have this on the end. But, this is from a while back, and so it's still a really good quality hoop. But like I said, you can't get these anymore. But anyway, most of these, especially these bigger ones, are the nicer ones. And anyway, but you can see how I have them all wrapped. And I've wrapped them in what's called cotton twill tape. And what that does, just basically, it allows the inner and outer hoop to squeeze the fabric more tightly, because these are a circle, and even though they've got tension on them, there can be gaps in them. Even the better quality ones, I mean, it's just it's just wood, really. So that helps to get a tighter squeeze when you get that fabric in there. And the other good thing about it is it holds it the whole time. Previously, like when I very first started, I was using these inexpensive hoops without the inner hoop being wrapped, and I spent the whole time I stitched. I would stitch a little, and then the fabric would get loose, and I would tug on it, and I'd stitch and tug. Really tired of that. Once I started doing this, my fabric stays tight the whole time. You don't want to use. I mean, my favorite um, material is the cotton twill tape. You can use just strips of fabric, but use cotton. You don't want to use a shiny, bias tape, or a shiny fabric, or a shiny, like a grosgrain ribbon, because those slip. And the point is to get a little bit of grip. All right, so that is my sermon about using a wrapped hoop to get a super tight hoop. Okay, really tight fabric. I got it in the hoop and I kept pulling it. I pull both, all directions, so it's really tight. The other thing I've done here is I have used these lovely, gigantic scissors, but honestly, as ugly as they are some of my favorite scissors to use, because they are scalloped pinking shears. And you can use, if you have a pair of zigzag pinking shears, but I always trim the edge of my fabric, and what using the pinking shears does is it keeps it from unraveling, or raveling. I guess it's unraveling. So, if you just have raw edged fabric, those little threads just are constantly, they'll get caught in your stitching in the back. If I know I'm going to leave my design like this, leave it in the hoop, I know I can trim off the excess fabric. If you're making a pillow cover or something like that, you would not trim away your fabric. But anyway, that's what I'm doing here. And like I said, these were so hard to find for so long. Once I found them, I decided to carry them in my shop because they're great for decorative stuff too. I also do wool felt ornaments, and I love to trim the edges of felt in these. It's so pretty. I have them in a couple different sizes. But regardless, for this practical reason, I love using them for the edge of the fabric here. I promised we were going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to do this, and we are finally here. So, stretched fabric in your hoop, then you need your design, and I have cut it out on the dotted line. I always design my patterns so they will fit inside the hoop. This one, see how it will fit inside the back there, okay? And then the other thing you will need, well, two other things, is something with which to trace the pattern onto the fabric. And I know some of you are probably familiar with this. It's the Frixion erasable gel pen. Erasable. I say that in quotation marks because I love this pen. I use it all the time. But you do have to know that even though you can erase the lines with heat, I use a hairdryer, that ink is still in the fabric. So if I like on this one, if I use it on this dark purple fabric, when I use the hairdryer to get that off, I'm going to have a white line. If I use it on white fabrics, this one probably, but like even on white fabric, it leaves kind of a, like you can't see the line if you look at it like maybe straight on. If you look at it at the side, like at an angle, or move the hoop around, it does leave like a yellow, very faint yellow line. So on this one, who knows what it would do? It would probably show up as a whitish line. But so that's, for that reason, I'm always very careful to trace carefully, and then I make sure I cover those stitches. Sometimes, sure, on the edge there'll be a little bit of line showing, especially this blue ink on this green fabric. There will be some of this blue ink that shows when I finish stitching, and so when I use the hair dryer on that, those lines will disappear and just sort of clean it up. But I don't just scribble on the fabric expecting this line to go away completely, because it won't. So to actually get this design onto this fabric, I like to put my fabric in the hoop with the side up that I'm going to be stitching. Then I flip it over. I take this design and I turn it face down. I like to spend a little time on the back. I shine, I kind of get a light shining through it, and I make sure that that design is, centered on the fabric. Hang on, I know you can't really see what I'm doing here. 1 second. I know you can. Okay, so let's just say that's good. All right, so that's kind of where I want it to be. And then I will take generally 3 pieces of this clear, Scotch tape, whatever you call it. And then I tape this design onto the back of the hoop. And I'm not just sticking it on the paper, I'm making sure I get a little bit stuck on up the edge and on there, and then I go about 1/3 of the way around and I do the same thing. 1/3 of the way around again and do the same thing. Okay. And now I can do a couple of things. I can put this up against a window, like a bright sunny window on the back side here, shining through with sunshine shining through, and I can very easily see this design. You can even see it. See when I press my fingers against the back of that fabric, see how you can even see it? Some fabrics, like white fabrics, often you don't even need to shine a super bright light behind it. If you put a bright white piece of paper behind it, or just a white table or whatever, you can see the lines, especially if they're kind of more simple lines. If you have really, really tons of little delicate lines, it helps to shine a bright light behind it. Honestly, when I do this, I sit at my desk and I have my, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. My super bright, really hard for you to see this, I know, but I have my super bright desk lamp like this, one of those swing arm ones, and I flip it towards me. I don't want to blind you, but if I shine that bright light behind it, can you see that? All right. Again, if I push my fingers up against it, if I'm not pushing against it, it's hard to see. If I press my fingers against it with a bright light behind it, I can see very clearly where to trace. And honestly, all I'm going to do is just, normally I'm you're kind of holding it up in midair, but hopefully this is in focus for you. I just carefully trace over those lines. All right. Now, this does require you, like I said, to kind of hold this up into the air and, be holding it with one hand and pressing against it. And so you're not maybe stable like you are on a table. So some people like to, and this is perfectly legitimate, some people like to, let me take this out. Hang on. Some people like to do this the opposite way. Let me get this out of here. So they stretch their fabric in the hoop like this, but this ends up being the side that they trace on. So then they take their pattern, and you can use a light box if you have one. I have one, but honestly, I don't like to drag it out that much, so that's why I use the sunny window or the bright light. But if you place this down, it's not going to be as bright on this blue background, but if you have a light colored background and then you place this on top, then you can see the pattern very well. And it's very stable because it's against your table. You're not having to press on the back or anything. And, just make sure that your design doesn't shift. You could even, I've got this one, I have tape on this one, so you could very easily tape it in place so it doesn't shift. Make sure it's taped well. Put it down on your light box, up against a window, on a light colored surface, and then trace it too. Very nice because, like I said, it's a nice hard surface. Some people stitch in their hoops this way. It's called stitching in the well. Perfectly legitimate. Great way to work. I personally like to stitch with my design facing, up this way. So that's why I like, once I stretch my fabric in the hoop, I don't love taking it out and restretching it, because when I have lined this up, I've lined it up, the way I want it to look. And with some designs like circles and like exact circles, like we're going to do with this moon, when you restretch it, sometimes it's hard to get those like perfect circles again when you've had to restretch it. So that's why I like this method where you do not have to restretch it. But you do what you like best. If you want to experiment with this way and then stitch it this way, that's great too. That's another great idea. All right, so I'm going to go trace this on here and I will show you what it looks like when it's done. There is one other thing I meant to tell you before I moved on, and that is that since we're tracing here, I've had a lot of people say that they are not very good tracers and that they don't get a very stable line when they're tracing. And I have a little tip for you. Generally, your hand is steadier when it is moving towards you. So I don't keep the hoop stable and move my hand around and try to trace, like this way, like of this big moon that I'm going to trace. I don't try to be like, okay, I'm going to start at this end and I'm going to go all the way. I don't do that. This is one reason I like to have it in hand, but I move the hoop around and I always generally try to pull a line towards me. So if you can, I don't know if you'll be able to see those lines under there. I can see them. Anyway, I am going, well, let me turn the light on so you can see it. In fact, sometimes it helps, and I'll show you this, to have the room dark and you can see the pattern, especially if you're using like your desk lamp. If it's super bright in the rest of the room or you have another light shining right on it, it's maybe a little harder to see, so that's why I turned that light off. So hopefully, yeah, I think you can see that. Okay, so when I'm tracing up here, I'm going to start here and make that line and stop. And then I'm going to turn the hoop a little bit and I'm going to do this line here. And I just keep turning the hoop the whole time so that I'm always pulling a line towards me instead of side to side or away from me. And even on like curved lines, oh, I know that light is probably blinding you. I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well. This moth up here, like curved lines, same thing. Even though that line continues, now I will turn it around. And even though that line, now to finish up that whole shape, I will come towards me again. All right, so that's just a little tip to help you if you feel like you're unsteady while you're tracing. I find that my hand is always steadier when I come towards myself instead of side to side or away from me. Alrighty, all finished with that part. And see, now we can go do what I like to call the fun part. Let's go stitch. Before we jump right into the stitching, let me talk about how to stop and start your stitching. And I'll show you the way I do it. And it is this little guy right here. That is a knot. Now you might be aware that some people, some kind of old school stitchers, get their panties in a twist about knots. But you know what? I have been putting a lot of knots in my stitching forever, and the embroidery police have not knocked on or knocked down my door yet. So I am going to keep doing it that way, and just, living the outlaw life, right? Okay, so let me show you how I get this little guy in there. All right, so I was a sewer before I was a stitcher, and I spent a lot of time doing it this way, where you wrap it around the end of your finger and then, roll it off like that. And sometimes I could get that to work. See, that one just fell out. But you know, if your hands are really dry and you wrap it and you twist and then it doesn't work and you try it again and the knot is way up here. I just, oh, that method is just, I'm done with that method. I don't want, I have to put we use so many threads, needles that have thread on them that need to put a knot in. I don't want to have to make 4 attempts, 2 or 3 or 4 attempts every time I have to do that. So I want it to work right the first time. So this method works every single time. It's called a quilter's knot, and I love it. So you take your threads go to the end of your threads. I've got my needle on this side, and you lay those threads onto the needle and hold it with this hand. Now you're going to take this hand and wrap it around the needle. You can wrap it once or twice or 3. It depends on how many strands you're using. I'll talk more about that in just a second. But anyway, you wrap that thread around the needle. Honestly, it doesn't really matter if you go clockwise or counterclockwise. I tend to twist it towards me. And then you're going to transfer it so that you're holding it with the other hand. It doesn't matter if you're right or left-handed, but anyway, you just do the other hand. I'm holding very gently. I didn't wrap those wraps too tightly, and I'm not squeezing this too hard, but I have the little tail sticking out there. And then you just push your needle through, and you're going to pull that needle and thread through the wraps that you're holding with this hand, and there is your knot. Works every single time. Now I did leave a pretty long tail on that, and every single knot that I make for the end of my thread, I make sure that I trim it off very short. Why do I take the time to do that? Because if I left a long tail on there and then I pull it up through the back of my fabric, I'm going to have a little length of thread, and I have tried to skip that step where I trim the little tail off, and when I start stitching next to that thread later on with a different color or whatever, inevitably you end up pulling that tail up through to the front of your fabric, and it shows, and you got to drag it to the back. And anyway, I didn't like that either. So I take the time to trim that tail off really short like that, and then it never bothers me. Now let me show you how I knot on, when I'm finished stitching, how I knot on the back of the hoop. Let me show you that. Okay, there's my knot, there's my thread. I come up, I do all my stitching. Now I'm done with my stitching. Now I'm going to flip this over and go to the back of my hoop. Let me get it so you can see it. Let me take 1 minute to adjust that so you can see it better. Here we are on the back now, and I've come up so you can see it better on this side of the first knot. So what I do to get what you want to do now is put a knot that's really, really close up against the fabric, because if the knot is, out here 1/2 inch away, then the stitch on the front could get pulled loose, right? So what I want to do is make this really close knot, and to do that, I make sure, now I'm right-handed, so I make sure that the thread is up above, and I hold it with this hand. I take my needle and I put it underneath. All right, now here's where you kind of have to, I'll pull it all the way through. Now you've got this kind of lasso-y kind of thing happening, right? So now is when I'm going to pull with this right hand, and I'm going to pull with the left hand, opposite directions, and I'm going to make that little slip knot, little spot, go right up against the fabric. Now I'm going to hold it with my finger, one of your fingers, doesn't matter which one, and now I'm going to pull. And that gets that little bitty knot right up against the fabric. So let me show you that again. I know it's a little bit, it's one of those things that if you think about it, you almost can't do it if you just do it. Your hands know how to do it. So I hold with this hand. The thread is up above here, and I go underneath, and I pull it till I get a loop like this, and I pull it, I slide that all the way down until it's up against the fabric. Hold it with a finger, pull, there's another knot. The other thing that I do just to, and now I mean, you could just trim this right up against that knot for the same reason we trimmed it here. You don't want a long tail that could get in the way and get pulled up with some future stitching. So to give myself, but to also give myself a little bit of a safety measure. So if I trim that knot really close and that knot is, maybe loosens over time, that stitch could come out. So to give myself a little space before I trim it off, I will very often just run my stitching. That one was pretty far over. Didn't really need to leave that much, but I'll just run my stitches, a couple of stitches under some nearby stitching, and now I will trim it off really close to the fabric. So now it's not going to get in the way, and I've given myself a long tail, but it's not going to get in the way of future stitching. I told you I would talk a little bit more about how many times to wrap the thread when you're making the knot at the end before you start. And it depends mostly on how many strands you're using and your fabric. If you're using a fabric that has a very tight weave, your knot doesn't have to be as large. If you're using a real loose weave linen that, the holes in the fabric are a little bit larger, then you're going to want a larger knot so that it doesn't pull through those bigger holes. This is a fairly tight weave fabric. This is 100% cotton. I'm using 3 strands here. So to do that knot, usually my kind of general rule for knots for 3 strands is to just wrap it once, like that. But if I was using just 1 strand, I would wrap it more than once, because a 1 strand of thread wrapped once is a little teeny tiny knot, and it could very easily, you could pull it pretty hard and pull it up through here. So for like if I'm using 1 strand, sometimes I wrap it 3 or 4 times. 2 strands, maybe 2 or 3 times. So just, and if it pulls through the first time, just snip it off and add another knot and you're good to go. So just kind of make a judgment call about how many times you wrap the thread. Guess what, y'all? We get to start stitching. Yay! Okay, so starting. You might be asking yourself, where do we start? Where do I start? What do I have to start in one place or another? Does it matter? Well, the answer to that is sometimes it matters and sometimes it does not. So when you have stitching, like if flowers, let's say you're going to do a leaf and then you're going to put a textured flower on top of that leaf. Well, then you'd want to do the leaf first and the flower second, because physically the flower threads are going to sit on top of the leaf or cover the leaf. If you've got a flower and a leaf that are both stitched flat, that bump up next to each other like that, it doesn't matter. Do the flower first and then the leaf. On this one, it doesn't matter so much. So, because most of this is just, stitching that is sort of all one level. It's all flat. I'm not sure about the moth up here, what I'm going to do, but I just know I'm going to stitch that a little bit later. Haven't quite decided on that yet. So, let's start with these ferns. I'm calling them ferns, okay? We are going to start by stitching the stem. You can see here's the finished one, and I guess here's another instance. You could technically stitch all of these leaves first, but in my brain it makes more sense to have a straight stem that you then stitch the leaves up next to. So that's why we're starting with the stem versus the leaves on this one, even though they are technically, they sit next to each other like that and not on top of each other. Okay, hopefully that made sense. So I am using 2 strands of this solid green DMC. I believe it is number 906. And numbers of strands. That might be another question you're asking yourself. Why more strands or fewer strands? Well, it kind of depends on perhaps how thick you want your stitch or your line to be. How much texture or bulk you want. And because this is a fairly delicate fern, I am using 2 strands. If I was doing something that was a little more robust, like larger ferns or something, or that's something that I really wanted to stand up, I might use 3 strands. I rarely use 4, but when I'm doing more strands. But for this, 2 strands ended up being perfect. Now, the stitch that we are going to use for these stems, I'm going to stitch this just solid green thread. I'm going to do the main stem, and then each of these little secondary main stems. I'm not, these little offshoot things, those are the leaves, so don't stitch those. We are just going to stitch this long curved stem and then each of these sort of medium long curved stems. Okay, the stitch we're going to use for this is the split back stitch. So I have a completely separate this basic tutorial about the split back stitch. It kind of is lumped in with back stitch, split back stitch, and split stitch. So I'm going to play that now so that you can watch that, and it's pretty quick. So even if you have done those stitches before, I suggest maybe watching that again because there's a couple little tips in there that might be new information for you. So let's go watch the video about how to do the split back stitch. Hello everyone, I'm Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to this tutorial for the back stitch, the split back stitch, and the split stitch. The back stitch, the split back stitch, and the split stitch are all pretty similar, and so that's why I have sort of bundled them together all in one tutorial. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you just the basics about how to do each one. But after that's finished, make sure you stick around because I'm going to give you a few thoughts about why you would want to use one versus another, and maybe just a couple of tips and tricks for each one. So first up, let's start with the back stitch. And it is, as I said, one of the most basic stitches because it's very simple. And it literally is a stitch and then you go back and do another stitch, which is where it got its name, obviously. So you're going to take your first stitch up and then down. So now for the second stitch, get that piece of fuzz off there. So now you're going to jump ahead a stitch length and then go back. So now I will come up on my line, out ahead of where I went down for the previous stitch, and now I will go back and put the needle down right where the last stitch ended. And that is all there is to it. Come up, go back, come up, go back, and there you go. That is why it is a basic stitch. Not a whole lot to it, and it makes a nice line. Let me do one more stitch so we can compare. Alright, so there is the back stitch. Now let's talk about the split back stitch. So now that we know how to do the back stitch, I'm going to hop down here and we will do one stitch. And now I will do the same thing. I will come up, I will jump out ahead of, on the line. So I'll leave a space. But now, instead of going down right where that first stitch ended, I'm going to go down inside that stitch. I am going to take my needle and split that first stitch. Now I will jump out ahead on the line, leave a space, come up, and now go down, splitting the previous stitch. So let me get a few of those done so you can compare that one to the previous one. And maybe already you can see that the difference, the way these look, the difference is that whereas the back stitch lends itself to kind of almost, I say it almost looks like a dashed line, or a dotted line, but like a dashed line, because you see the place where your needle went down in between each stitch. This one, it's kind of buried, so it lends itself to a more continuous, smooth, or solid looking line. Now let me show you the split stitch. Start the same exact way, make one stitch, and now instead of coming out ahead of this line, I'm going to come up inside the line. So I am going to feel around until that needle comes up inside and splits the stitch. Now I will take a stitch forward. Same thing, come up inside the line, split that stitch, go forward, split the previous stitch, go down, and that is all there is to the split stitch. So that is the simple basic technique how to do each of those stitches. Now let's talk a little bit more about each stitch and some of the pros and cons. So the back stitch, I went ahead and finished each line so that you could compare them easily. And the back stitch, very easy, right? Excellent for a line, but as basic as this stitch is and as simple as it is honestly a little bit hard to get a nice straight line. It tends to, no matter, I've stitched a lot of back stitching and you can tell even this one tends to, sometimes the stitches look a little bit zigzaggy or a little bit jagged, and there's just something about, no matter how careful you are, you just have a little bit of a difficult time getting that line to look completely smooth. It has many purposes, and sometimes it's the basis for other stitches, but there's something about it that it's not as simple as you think it would be to get a nice straight line. Now these two, I think you can see that they have a much more smooth consistency to them, and there's just something about them that they just look straighter. Even if you're doing curves, curves with a back stitch or curves with these, the back stitch one always will tend to be a little bit, just not have a smoothness to it, whether it's a straight line or a curved line. So these two, I use the split back stitch all of the time. I love it. It has a little bit of weight to it. You can do it with 2 strands or 6 strands, 3, 4, 5 strands, whatever. It's a little bit hard to do a split stitch with 1 strand, so I would say maybe 2 and up. And I love the split back stitch for stems and all sorts of things. It's quick and it gives a nice smooth line. It also can look like a very tiny, really tight chain stitch, and I like that look. The split stitch obviously looks very similar. The difference is sometimes why I would choose the split stitch over the split back stitch is because the split back stitch is a thread hog. Because you're jumping ahead and going back, and then you jump ahead and you go back and you jump ahead and go back, you leave a lot of thread on the back of your fabric. The split stitch does not do that, because you make a stitch and you just jump back a little tiny bit and then you move forward and you go back a little tiny bit and move forward. It uses much less thread. Why does that matter? Well, let me say this. It is easier to, let me get that out. It's easier to go down and split a stitch, when you're trying to pierce the previous stitch with your thread, with your needle. It is much easier to go, because you can see what you're doing. It's much easier to split that stitch and be accurate when you're trying to split it when you're going down. When you're coming up from the back and trying to, fish around and find just the right, split those threads just right, it takes longer. And no matter how much I do this, it just takes longer. So sometimes you just want to move along, but if I am using a thread that is just, if I'm just using regular DMC or just whatever, I will almost always go for the split back stitch. If I am using a thread, in 2 instances, say I'm using a silk thread that's really expensive and I want to leave all of that thread, or as much of that thread as possible, on the front of the fabric and not on the back where nobody will see it, I would maybe choose the split stitch as opposed to the split back stitch. If I'm running low on thread and I have just, like a very little bit left and I have a certain number of stitches to do, I'll choose the split stitch versus the split back stitch. If I am using a variegated thread and I don't want to leave a lot of that, sometimes variegated threads have, a section of one color and then a section of another color and a section of another color. Sometimes you leave a lot of those different colors on the back of the fabric. And again, I want that color to be on the front. Those, the gradations from one color to the next. I don't want to lose a lot of those sections of color. So I would choose the split stitch for using variegated thread. Now, before I leave, I thought I would throw in a bonus stitch for you. Let's learn how to do the whipped back stitch. You know how I said the back stitch is sometimes used as the basis for other stitches? Well, here's one. So I've got my back stitch up here, and remember how I said sometimes it can look a little jagged? Well, let's whip this back stitch. So I'm going to come up. Let's say I ended here. So I'm gonna come up on this end. I stitched across, and that's where my thread ended. All right, so I'm going to come up, and now I'm going to take this needle and I'm going to put it underneath that last stitch. Whoops, lost my needle. Let me go rethread my needle. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. All right, I've just gone underneath that one. Now I'm going to go back again from the top and put that needle under that stitch. Try not to catch it in anything else. And now I will just do that all the way across. Like that. Very quick, very easy. And the benefit of this is that now, whereas before you had kind of a, like I said, sort of a, maybe a, like a separated a little bit of a line. Now you have a nice smooth line. Whipped back stitch is a great alternative. If you don't want to do the split stitch or the split back stitch, it's a great alternative for lettering, lines, stems, all sorts of things. So it's very simple, and now you have this nice smooth line. So that's a really great technique to, bump up your back stitch if it's not looking so great. I have started stitching, and as I said, we're going to do the split back stitch on these stems. And you know how to do that. Come up ahead, go back, and split the previous stitch with your needle. With 2 strands, you have to make sure you split it instead of going next to the stitch, because you've got these 2 little bitty strands, and so you really want to take just a second to make sure that you truly split, between those stitches. And one thing I wanted to talk about is, do you do the whole long stem and then go back and do each short stem? You can absolutely do that. You can do what I'm doing. I started up here and I work a little bit down and I come over. Let me jump down where you can see. And I come over and I do this little short one. And I do that little short one. And then I work my way down a little bit. So I'm here, for instance. I've worked my way down the main stem. Now I'm going to jump over and do the little side stem. Making sure that I split that stitch, a little teeny tiny one, a little teeny tiny stitch there at the end. All right, now I'm going to hop over from here to here and do this little side stem. Maybe 3 stitches on that one. Like that. And now I can hop back down here and continue on with the main. Come on. There we go. Okay, continue on with the main stem, and I can just keep going down, doing the main stem and then the side stems. Why am I doing it this way? It's kind of really just to sort of conserve thread. And I mean, like I said, you could work the whole main stem all the way down, finish off your, tie off your thread and not on the back, and come back and then do side, 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 side. and do that all the way down. Either one's fine. It looks just exactly the same. Before we call the stems done, I did want to point out to you that these little short lines that go out from each of these longer side stems, those are not stems. That's an indication of the mark about where to put the next stitch that we're going to do for the leaves. So when you're doing the stems, you don't need to put a green line, a solid green line on those little bitty marks. Those are for the daisy stitches that'll come next. One last little thing to discuss is how long to make each stitch. And you might be wondering, does it matter? Well, you can pretty much do these short or long. And of course, that's relative. For the split back stitch, when you do really, really short stitches, they're a little plumper. When you do, a longer stitch, like I consider that a fairly long stitch. It's maybe a quarter of an inch. Even though you're splitting the stitch is, the overall line ends up being a little more thinner, this way. But if I did like lots of little short stitches, each little split stitch would be a little plumper. Not that big of a deal. Either way, it's fine. I kind of, up here at the top, you see that? I sort of did shorter ones, and as I go the way down, as I work my way down, I'm kind of doing longer ones. That doesn't matter. You don't have to do that. You can start long up here and work your way down. So the length of stitch for this is just not that big of a deal. To finish up this fern, we are going to stitch all of the leaves with what's called a daisy stitch. So let me go show you how to do that stitch. The daisy stitch is another one of those most basic of stitches that has many, many uses. For instance, you can see it here. Here is a daisy stitch that has just a little single stitch, a little straight stitch inside of it of a different color for like a little bitty leaf. Here is a larger daisy stitch. These 6 right here are larger daisy stitches that have a bullion stitch inside of it. Then you've got a situation like this where each of these leaves is made up a series of longer daisy stitches. These each also have a different colored little straight stitch in the center of it, but you can see when they're all stacked up like this, instead of being individual leaves together, they all create one big fern leaf. So many things you can do with the daisy stitch. So let's get right to how to create this stitch. The daisy stitch is essentially like a teardrop shaped stitch, and you can change that shape a little bit according to how you sort of manipulate it. But I also want to inject here that sometimes the daisy stitch is also referred to as a detached chain stitch, because a chain stitch is made up of a line of connected daisy stitches. But I just call it the daisy stitch, and I use it very often. So when I say a teardrop, what I mean is it's basically a little teardrop shape like that. So how do we create it? All right, I've got my needle and thread here. You're going to come up at this point and then go back down in the same exact spot. All right, but do not pull the thread all the way through. You want to leave a loop like that. Then you want to come up with your needle at the top of that teardrop inside the loop. Bring your needle up, pull until you form that teardrop. To finish the stitch, you're going to go over the top of that shape and make one little anchoring stitch like that. So let's do that again. This time I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little bit more of what I'm doing. So let's do that again. I'm going to come up. Then I'm going to take the needle down exactly where I came up. Hold a loop of thread open, and then at the top of that stitch, come up through the loop, pull the thread, and form that teardrop, and then make one little anchoring stitch over the top, like that. One more time. Up, down in the same spot, hold open a loop, come up inside that loop, and pull the thread until the loop forms and make a stitch at the top. So here are a couple of things that sort of to know about the daisy stitch. I am doing what's called the stab method, where you go up in one motion with your needle and down with another motion and up. Each one is a separate motion. There's also the sewing motion with the daisy stitch, and sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to get the right tension, because the tension on a daisy stitch is sometimes a little bit wonky because you've got this teardrop formed. All right, so let me show you. My fabric is pretty tight, and it is harder to do the sewing method on really tight fabric, but let me see if I can do it. So I have come up. Now I'm going to put the tip of the needle back down where it goes in, but instead of taking it all the way through, I'm going to push up from the back and leave my needle like that. So now I can take this thread, I'm pushing up on the needle a little bit, so I raise the tip, and I'm going to wrap that thread around it so it catches underneath, and now I can pull the needle through, and that forms a little teardrop. Again, so it's kind of your preference. I generally tend to do the stab method because you can see that one didn't turn out so great. Looking at these, it's obvious to see the variation you can get just in how tall you make the stitch or in how hard you pull the thread. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to make sort of a little short, squatty, a little more rounder daisy stitch like that, and I'm going to do that by not pulling the thread too much. All right, I didn't pull it so much that it pulled it really skinny. Now I will do a thinner, more narrow daisy stitch. In fact, I'll make it try to make it the same height. Okay, but now this time, and here's another hint about the daisy stitch, when I'm pulling this thread, instead of pulling it up, like straight up towards you, I tend to pull it that direction. I pull it a little bit flat against the fabric, and that helps to keep that loop that's going to form kind of in line a little bit. So I'm going to pull that, but now this time I'm going to pull pretty hard. So I pulled quite a bit there. I know that thread's getting a little bit lighter color because it's a variegated thread, but you can hopefully see the difference in this rounder daisy stitch and this skinnier daisy stitch. You can make them very long and skinny, like that. Okay, that makes great fun, kind of like I showed you before. You could do individual ones like that for like a fern leaf or something like that. It makes great flower petals. Many uses for the daisy stitch, like I said. And before I wrap up this tutorial, let me just do two little quick troubleshooting things that can sometimes happen with daisy stitches. One of them is that the tension on the threads, it happened a little bit here, but the tension on the threads can end up being a little bit different, and it can happen more as you stitch more and more. I'm using 3 strands here, and just my luck, I won't be able to get it to happen. But sometimes if you pull that, see, it didn't happen. But what can happen is that like one of these threads can get a little bit different, can be pulled not the same as the others. See how that one? So when that happens, as I'm pulling the thread, before I pull it tight, if you just keep pulling on this one, that thread is not ever going to get into line. So what you have to do is go up here and just gently separate each one and pull on it. And what do you know? For once, never happens. The first one I choose is the one that is the one that's loose. So let's say, for instance, I had chosen this one first. If I pull on it, it's not really helping. If I pull on this middle one, it kind of gets that one in line. And then if I pull on this one, the magic one, if I pull on it, see how it pulled it into line. Now it's still a little bit loose. Yeah, see, I kind of lost it there. Oh, see, that one's kind of lost. All right, let's just try again. That works. That one got really messed up. So let's just try again. All right, that one's a little bit better, but like I said, all you need to do is just separate the strands and try to find the one that's out of place. And if you just gently pull it back in line, your daisy stitch will look great again. The other thing that can happen is as you continue to stitch stitch more and more, if you do like a whole bunch of daisy stitches in a row, your thread gets a little bit, I don't know, kind of wound together again. And so this is a good stitch for as you stitch longer and longer or do more daisy stitches, is to let that thread underneath hang. And I know you can't see it in here because I can't hold it up high enough, but take your hoop and just let the thread hang, and so that thread will unwind because it gets a little bit twisted up. But other than that, those are kind of the two main things that can happen, and so really simple fixes for both of those. So there you go. There is the very versatile, very basic, very wonderful daisy stitch. Now that you know all about the daisy stitch, that's all we're going to do for all of these leaves on these ferns. Now, I think I covered almost everything in that little daisy stitch tutorial. The one thing I actually meant to talk about and didn't was how you can extend the little stitch on the end of, the little anchoring stitch. And let me show you what I'm about to talk about. So you can just make that little bitty stitch, just a short little tiny stitch that will just hold that thread in place. Right? That's how I showed it on the video. So there's that daisy stitch. But you can also extend that little anchoring stitch out a little bit, make it just a teeny bit longer, and that gives this little teardrop shape, it makes it more, gives it more of a pointed tip. It's just kind of a visual illusion almost. So that's what I'm doing on all of these daisy stitches for these little bitty leaves. I wanted a little bit more of a point for each one. And the only other thing I can think of to tell you about all of these is to talk about the length of the stitches. These are, generally speaking, pretty small little bitty daisy stitches because they're little tiny leaves. But when I was working up here at the top, that one's a really tiny little stitch, and then these are tiny, tiny, and as I continue to stitch down this whole fern, they get a little bit longer here in the middle part of the fern, and then as I get down here, they will be even longer. So you can see over here, they're not like, 3/4 of an inch long. They're just longer down here than they are up at the top. And that's really the only thing. This is a fun part because we get to start stitching with Nicole's beautiful variegated threads. And this is, leaves are a great place to use variegated threads because, naturally leaves are different colors of green, yes. And it's just so much fun to see each color as it kind of shows up as you are stitching along. I knew there was one other thing I wanted to mention here as we get into more of this stitching, and that is about traveling threads on the back side of the hoop when you move from stitching one area to another area. Now, I the general rule is on light colored fabrics, white or really light colored fabrics, I try not to travel my threads a long way away, long distances across the back of the fabric. So if I'm going to stitch something over here and the next place I'm using that color is way over here, I'm probably not going to stretch that thread all the way across to here, because if it's a light colored fabric, it could show through on the front, and I don't want this like shadowy, line going across there. Dark colored fabrics, it doesn't matter because it won't show. If you're stitching on dark blue or black or dark gray or charcoal, those, any color of thread is not really going to show up on the back. So it's fine. You are going to not waste. You're going to use more thread that way. And if you've got plenty of thread and you don't want to take the time to end the thread over here and then cut it off and start anew and then that's fine. Just do that. But if it's a white or light colored fabric, I don't travel threads for a long distance. Now here, I am traveling a little bit of a distance. Like if I finish up, so I'm just about to, let me do it for you. I'm just about to stitch this leaf. All right, and now I have a choice. I can skip down to this one or I can skip over to this one. Doesn't really matter. Let's just say I skip over here. That is such a short distance to go from this one, even if I were to stretch over here to this first leaf on the end, it's just like, what is that? Not even, half an inch or something. It's not going to show. I've got other stuff going on back here. Even on this, and this color of green is kind of it's almost like a medium. It's like you could sort of maybe get away with traveling threads across the back and they wouldn't show. You might just want to see, but that is such a short distance. So on the back, I'm just going back and forth. In fact, let me flip this over and I will show you. See that? Can you see all those threads going back and forth? So, so that's what it looks like on the back. Okay, so anyway, that's just sort of my quick little thoughts on traveling threads across the back of the fabric and when you would do it and when you would maybe not want to do it.